We're going to talk now about Aristotle's theory of the three types of equal friendships. And we talked at the end of last time about unequal friendships. The visual for this particular video and the next one is this handout on Aristotle on friendship, which you'll find on Brightspace. And I will just note that the page numbers that are given here are for an older edition in a different translation than the one we're using for this course. You need to add about 5 pages in order to find those texts, those quotations in your text. So that's for purposes of finding them for your paper. You want to make sure you're not using these page numbers, but the page numbers from the edition of the text and the translation of the text that we're using. Now, that being said, it can be helpful, particularly on a passage that you look at and you're not quite sure what it means, to compare two translations with one another, because sometimes the newer translation will be clearer, but sometimes the older translation will be clearer. Now, just to talk about the overall categories, these 3 overall categories that Aristotle gives of equal friendships. So we have friendships of pleasure, friendships of utility, and friendships of virtue. Now, the first thing to say about them is, in order to understand friendships of utility, you can really think of those as friendships of mutual benefit, friendships where you get some practical benefit from one another, some reciprocal practical benefit, and it's usually some kind of material benefit, not the benefit of pleasure and not the benefit of virtue. Second thing to say about them is that the first 2 types, the friendship of pleasure and the friendship of utility, are both incomplete types of friendship. And only the friendship of virtue, over in the 3rd column, is one that Aristotle regards as complete or perfect friendship. And we'll see as we go along what he means by that. We'll come back to that point a few times. But if you look, I'm just going to go through the left-hand column first, the friendships of pleasure, because that's going to give us a basis for contrasting friendships of utility and friendships of virtue, or comparing and contrasting, because they each overlap the others in some way. So you might think of 3 circles, if you know what a Venn diagram is, 3 circles that intersect, and they have a common core, which allows us to call them all friendships, but they also differ in different ways. They have parts of the circle that lie outside of this intersecting part. But in addition to that overlapping point, Aristotle wants to say that the only friendship that is a true friendship in the full sense, a complete friendship, is the friendship of virtue. But let's talk first about this incomplete friendship of pleasure. Now, a friendship of pleasure is a friendship where what 2 people share is the fact that they take pleasure in the same kind of activity. So that activity could be making music, listening to music, it could be drinking alcohol, potentially using a certain other mind-altering chemical. It could be gardening, it could be baking, it could be a particular kind of exercise or sport. But the point is that the friendship in this case is based on pleasure. That's the foundation that the friendship is built upon, and the pleasure is shared, and it's shared equally. That's what makes this an equal friendship. Now, one of the consequences, and it's the first consequence that Aristotle notes, is that if I have a friendship of pleasure with someone, one of the consequences is that I do not love that person for themselves. At least I don't love them for their whole selves. I love them for the part of themselves that feels pleasure, and not even all of the part of themselves that feels pleasure. I love them for the part of themselves that feels pleasure in the same activity that I feel pleasure in. So this strange little obsession I have with collecting old-fashioned fountain pens, right? I have certain friends, at least online friends, right? And what we share is a pleasure in these fountain pens. Now, they may have very different values from mine. They may have different politics from mine. They certainly may be of a different religion from mine, but we share that in common. What I love about them is that they too have a little obsession with buying and collecting and using these funny objects. Okay, so that's the basis of the friend. I don't love the whole self. I only love a fragment of them. And I only love a fragment of them with a fragment of myself. Okay, so that's the first feature. The second feature Aristotle notes, and by the way, what I've done is I've put these quotations in an order that's logical to myself. They're sort of scattered over, especially sections 3 and 4 of Book 8 of the Nicomachean Ethics. But the next is, these friendships are formed easily and quickly, and they also dissolve easily and quickly. And there's more than one reason for that. But the main reason, or the first reason that Aristotle notes, is that our pleasures change quickly, right? So during the coronavirus epidemic, at least early in the, or pandemic, a lot of people got into baking sourdough bread, right? And so in the r/sourdough subreddit, you see thousands and thousands of new people turning up and subscribing to that subreddit and posting their questions and problems as they try to make good sourdough bread, and then posting photographs of their successes once they have them. But some of those people, after a few weeks or months of doing that, are going to move on to something else. They're going to throw out their sourdough starter and sell or give away some of their equipment, and maybe never try to bake sourdough bread again. Our pleasures change quickly, and so our friendships of pleasure change quickly. So we make friends quickly when we discover a new hobby, but also when we get bored with that hobby or bored with that pleasure and find something else. We dissolve those friendships and we get new ones. We're very fickle, very volatile when it comes to pleasure, and the relationships that we build on pleasure are like that. And so if you turn over to page 2 of this 4-page handout, friendships of pleasure tend to be prevalent among young people. And that's because Aristotle says, now you may take offense at this, but friendships between young people seem to exist because of pleasure, since they live in accord with their feelings and pursue most of all what is pleasant for themselves and present at hand. Now, you might say, yeah, Aristotle, you're kind of underestimating young people and not remembering what it's like to be young. But there is a kernel of truth in what Aristotle says here. And I think you can see this kernel of truth if you think about the fact that young people talk a lot less about real estate and retirement than young people do, right? So you may know one person in your age group, college age group, who is already saving for retirement. But that person is very unusual and considered kind of peculiar by the rest of you. Okay, so these friendships of pleasure are characteristic of young people, although obviously older people will still have some, but friendships of pleasure predominate at a young age. this next point that Aristotle talks about is that when two people enter friendship of pleasure, they want to spend time together, even live together. You might find a roommate who has a similar hobby or a similar sport to the one that you're passionate about. So these friends of pleasure want to live together and maximize their time together. But also, the next point, Aristotle says they're vulnerable to slander, mistrust, and the fear of injustice. So think of it this way. If you form a friendship of pleasure with someone, so remember, we get into those sometimes on a moment's notice. We meet somebody who is a fan of the same band that we are, and they immediately become friends, and they might stay friends for a while, or they might not. But let's say another friend of ours says, Richard, that you've made this friendship with around your sport, he's actually not a very good person. He cheats on his friends. He cheats on his girlfriend or boyfriend. He will steal money from you if he had the chance, and so on and so forth. You will end that friendship on a moment's notice and never call Richard back again on the basis of someone you trust that maybe you've known longer than you've known Richard, who says something bad about him. They're vulnerable to slander, mistrust, and the fear of injustice. So if you think that Richard has done something that is unjust or unfair to you, you may not think a lot about it and investigate it and so forth. You may simply break off the friendship because, in fact, you can find new ones fairly easily. Okay. And then the next point is not completely obvious, but we'll see if we can get what Aristotle's saying here. And that is that the friendship of pleasure is defective, right? And Aristotle hinted at this in the very first point he made about friendships of pleasure, which is that they involve a love or affection of one person for another person on the basis only of a part of oneself, and a love for only a fragment, a corresponding fragment in the other person. And so Aristotle says these kinds of friendships are friendships by similarity with friendships of virtue, friendships in the full sense. They share something with it, with that friendship in the full sense, but they're not the full friendship. So sometimes we say, oh, that's not a very good friend, it's not a very close friendship. Or we might even say, well, I know him, or even I'm acquainted with him, I've met him, I know who he is, but and I've maybe spent some time with him, but not that much, but it's not a close friendship, it's not a true friendship. That's what Aristotle is talking about. That's one of the ways that his use of the term friendship is somewhat different from ours. So I'm going to break the video at this point so it doesn't get too long and continue with friendships of utility and friendships of virtue in the next video.